Yeah, hello and good morning. We are very pleased to have here with us Jem Bendell, the author of Breaking Together. I'm Hans Eickhoff, I'm a member of the Portuguese Degrowth Network and the International Degrowth Network, and I'm here together with my colleague Guilherme, also from the Portuguese Degrowth Network, besides many other things, obviously. And we will have a small talk with Jem about how to engage the degrowth community in a conversation about facing collapse. So first of all, thank you again for being here with us and accepting our invitation. And you wrote the deep adaptation paper in 2018, and then later on you edited the book together with Rupert Reed on deep adaptation as well. And now in 2023 you wrote Breaking Together, which is published now in Portuguese, in Juntos na Ruptura. And so how would you describe your path and your evolution since the deep adaptation paper until Breaking Together and today? Yeah, and maybe you can just a little bit like doing a small sum up for the people that are here with us in this podcast.
Sure. So, yeah, the deep adaptation paper I wrote as a result of studying the climate science for about a year for the first time in many years, because I was in corporate sustainability as a professor. So I had just assumed that what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said was correct, or the best knowledge about climate change. But I began to worry quite a lot, starting in about 2014, about what we were actually seeing with climate change and thinking this is going too fast. So I took time out from my job and I looked at the science and I was horrified. And so then I published that because I didn't think it would be appropriate to keep working on effectively an incremental change agenda, which is what you do in corporate sustainability. And I also therefore thought I should tell everyone in my profession, in my field of research and consulting and all the, corporate sustainability managers there are. Like, why am I quitting this? Why are we denying the reality and how bad it is? So that threw me into the field of collapse studies. I didn't know there was a field of collapse studies. Now we call it collapsology. I didn't know about that. So I've come a long way since then in July 2018 when it came out because of the massive reaction to that paper. And it wasn't just environmentalists, it was people who actually work on this idea of societies breaking down, how they've broken down in the past, how this one is going to break down. That was all new to me. And so then I started reading and inquiring into all of that. So Breaking Together is the result then of the 5 years of interdisciplinary inquiry after the deep adaptation paper. The big shift for me was that because I wasn't looking at things beyond climate change in the deep adaptation paper, and because I was privileged and having quite a nice life, I didn't realize that we're already in a process of societal breakdown worldwide. We're already having the key indicators, life expectancy, health, biodiversity loss, all sorts of these key indicators that they're going in the wrong way, and they have been for some time. I think, like most people, I assumed that, if a country or a group of people are having difficulty, then that can be fixed, and that humanity is still progressing. So I kind of assumed that back then. And then I realized that's not the case. So in Breaking Together, I broadened the scope to look at energy systems, food systems, economic and monetary systems, not just the climate. And I point to the evidence which suggests that societies have already begun to break down. So that's the big shift in terms of like analyzing the situation we're in.
Good. And so what are the main drivers actually that you identified that provoke this collapse and this ongoing collapse actually that is happening already?
So yeah, what I did was I looked at a bunch of indicators, which we might say indicators of human development or sustainable development, stable climate and ecologies and so on. And okay, that's not good. The data is not good. But then, looking deeper at the foundations of our way of life. So we live in industrial consumer societies. Very few of us are making or growing the stuff we use or eat every day. We buy mass-produced stuff, which is entirely dependent on use of cheap energy, which allows specialization and mass production. 80% of all primary energy is still coming from fossil fuels. That's a global figure. And we are a grain-based civilization, so I think it's about 60%, the worldwide average of calories that we eat, or that the animals that we eat, that they eat. The 60% of the calories come from grains, and of those, half of all the grains in the world are mass-produced using artificial fertilizer, which comes from natural gas, what we call natural gas, fossil gas. So, we have a civilization that's, at the moment, entirely dependent on fossil fuels. It's not just about switching energy for cars or electricity. It's what we eat. We're basically eating fossil fuels. That's our basic energy source. So I looked at these kind of things, it's a bit ridiculous, really, that I worked in sustainable development and corporate sustainability for decades, and I kind of didn't really pay attention to some of the fundamentals and realize, oh dear, we are such a hydrocarbon civilization. This net zero transition story is ignoring some of the huge difficulties. We can't, renewables are not substituting fossil fuels. Then it's not happening. They're just adding to the energy production. So that was a massive wake up for me, because I was previously an eco-modernist. I thought we need to just use our skills, intelligence, better leadership, better use of investment, educate everybody, and then we'll all move on into a sustainability nirvana at some point. And then I realized that I'm ignoring the reality here. So that's all in Breaking Together. That's the first half of the book.
Yeah, and something else that you mentioned actually in Breaking Together, a very important driver is also our economic system, actually our monetary system.
Sure.
Maybe you want to just shortly expand on that before I hand over to Guilherme.
Yeah, so I'd done quite a bit of work on the nature of our monetary system before I did the deep adaptation stuff. It was a passion of mine since 2008. When a self-taught economist who was working in providing free open source software for communities to trade together and exchange together without money. And he said he was doing this work because he wanted to give people alternatives to being dependent on the banking system and bank-issued money. And I thought, what are you talking about? I didn't really think about how money was issued, and I thought, well, yeah, okay, it's a lot electronic, but doesn't it come from government? And then he taught me back in 2008 that actually no, the vast majority, we're talking 95 to 98% of money in any economy, is created by banks when they issue loans, because all it is an entry in their databases. So when we look at our account with a bank, and we see how much is in it, that's just the value of the promise of that bank to us, and knowing that other banks will agree, because they all work with SWIFT and BACS and so on. So we're just trading promises from banks, these representations of money. And of course, when banks create that, they're not just giving it away. What they're doing is they're giving it in exchange for a loan agreement. And so then the loan agreement is the bank's asset. But when they issue that money as debt, it also comes with an interest demand, an interest expectation over time. So one of the things that surprised me when I first looked at this, that means there's more debt in the world owed than there has been money created. Now, that system could work without the growth in economic transactions if all money earned in interest by banks was immediately spent back into circulation in order to keep things going. But that's absolutely not what happens. People with money keep it, and they save it, and the money isn't all spent back into circulation, and it means therefore that the interest demands help to create scarcity of money unless there are new loans issued for new economic activity. And that's why a steady state economy, let alone a shrinking economy in terms of GDP, is a very difficult situation for society and therefore for politicians, because it means that we're still the same people, the same needs, the same aspirations, the same buildings, the same forests, whatever, but suddenly our means of transacting, our money, starts to shrink. And so what does that mean? That means foreclosures of businesses and people defaulting on their loans and mortgages. So it's called recession, or ultimately depression. It's bizarre, isn't it? But that's comes about. So we call it a monetary growth imperative. So the nature of the money system means that we need to keep increasing the amount of loans, otherwise the money begins to disappear as the debts get paid off. You have to really get into the intricacies of this to see how it works. It's not as simple as just saying because we have interest we have these problems. There are theoretically ways that we could cope with interest and not have this situation, but it's a ridiculous idea that everyone who would earn interest would just spend it all immediately. It just doesn't happen. So we have the problem.
But so
and we have the problem because it demands expansion. We have to consume more, produce more. Otherwise, what are these loans for? Right.
Yeah, and I mean, not only from a bank level, but from a whole societal level. Yeah? You say that growth became God. Like in terms of, do you want to expand a little bit on this? Because it's not only the banks, it's also the state structures needs growth so that it can promise, gets investment in international.
Yeah, with that monetary system, it creates that it's like an operating system for a computer. Like it's the operating system for society. It means that it creates these ideas that corporations must grow. Every country, every town must grow as in increasing economic transactions, GDP, gross domestic product. So growth became God. Well, it just became assumed that, recession is bad, of course, because people would lose jobs and businesses would close. So people, therefore, and politicians, therefore, think that growth is an unquestionable good, a positive thing. And it's odd, really, because in other walks of life, we don't think that. A lot of us are really quite happy with the way our town used to be, and we don't want more and more buildings and more traffic and pollution and more busyness. We don't. It's weird. But in the area of economics, it's absolutely a dogma. So. That's what I mean by growth became the ideology of God.
Okay.
Unquestionable. You're a heretic if you question it.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, okay, so this is, we wanted to organize this interview around the topic of the Hopium of Degrowth, as in degrowth being something that's like theoretical.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to live in theory because in theory everything is okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but degrowth criticizes that narrative of growth is essential. And one of the things that all conversations about degrowth start or should start is the difference between a depression, a crisis of capitalism, a crisis of growth, and degrowth. So my question was, what is the definition of degrowth for you? So how do you think it? Because I know you're a critic of it.
So I think it's really positive that more and more scholars, intellectuals, academics, journalists and others are critiquing economic growth as the organizing principle for society and politics and so on. That's really important, and it's kind of obvious that we should be doing that. And so that can happen, and not all those people would therefore self-identify as being, as you say, in degrowth. For me, what is degrowth? Degrowth is a term, a concept, and now a bunch of communities, an intellectual area for people who want to talk about policies that respond to that critique, or even community level practices that respond to that critique of the fixation on growth. Whether it's a very useful term or framing, whether it's a very useful community of people who get together under that umbrella term or not is an interesting question. I have some views on that that come from my I have had one foot in academia and one foot in activism and practice throughout my life, and so from that perspective I have some questions and some criticisms of like the intellectual community of degrowth.
But also we see that degrowth advocates like ideas like well-being and solidarity and community. Yeah? You think that this is something that degrowth actually could be on where degrowth could be helpful to the debate, or you think that this really flaws of the degrowth concept actually?
Okay, so the issue I have with many academics, and I completely understand why this happens, because I understand as an academic, is where you look at the world and what people are doing in order to fit your categories, in order to tell a story, to get funding or to get published. And I see that happening in degrowth, but I see that happening in many other areas. And what it is, it's almost like a form of extractivism. It's where the academic who's maybe got a nice salary, a very clear career path, great pension prospects, goes around and looks at people who are doing all manner of things in life, in society, and then thinks, I can say that fits my model, my story, and I can get published and I have a conference about it and get a big grant on it. And that happens so often, and so many people who do good work at the local level get very annoyed with academics for that dynamic. There are lots of great things happening in every community. Time banks, community managed food growing allotments, there's tool sharing systems, or people doing community production, bringing vegetables to then get them processed. There's all amazing things happening. I don't think I met anyone doing any of that who's ever said they're doing degrowth, or doing regeneration actually, or doing sustainability, or doing any of that. That's all just the blah blah coming from above. Now the question then becomes, well, how is any of this blah blah from above, from people like me, helping anybody? And I don't put that as a rhetorical question. It's like, okay, how are we helping? How is an academic who gets a grant from the EU to say do resilience building or degrowth or whatever label, or local sustainability or whatever, or climate adaptation, whatever label we put on it, how are they actually being useful to the people who've decided to do things in communities? And could be, well, it often depends on the intention, integrity, and also the methodology of the academic. Do they just see these people as useful for their own little report, and then they get super excited that they get published in some boring journal that 5 people reads? Or do they actually want to work in solidarity and partnership with the people in the local level? And crucially then, listen to how they describe their lives, how they are, they have their own sovereignty and agency around concepts. So how are they describing it? If they're not describing it as adaptation, degrowth, resilience, or whatever. And a big issue also is the responsibility of the academic not to cause problems for those people through the way they describe it and the stories they tell. So I'll give you an example of, in the field of planning, kind of sounds boring, doesn't it? If you're a planning academic, it's boring. So someone became very famous when she published a paper and gave a speech about insurgent planning. Well, that sounds radical. So all these board planning academics got into insurgent planning, and they went around and said, well, insurgent planning happens where the state's not providing and the local government's not providing, so communities get together and then they provide what they need locally. But none of them called themselves, at the grassroots level, none of them called themselves insurgent planners. This was a phrase given to them. And then if you look at this, and some of the reports on this, like from the group Just Collapse, and they point to some initiatives in some parts of the world, you absolutely don't want to self-identify as an insurgent in those countries. And so I'm amazed at the lack of attention to, what could we call it? Epistemic respect. Like, how are the people themselves that you're studying defining their world, and how can we work with that? So yeah, with degrowth, I don't know how it's going to be useful to people at the grassroots level. I think another problem I see is that it can end up telling us a story that's not true. So that not only are you not really relevant to the people on the grassroots because they're not calling themselves degrowthers, then you've got a story being told that somehow all these amazing things at local level add up to some great big escape from the unsustainability of capitalism, led by a few smart people and bureaucrats. Like, that's just a nonsense. That's fantasy. I mean, a lot of these things being done locally are brave, brilliant coping mechanisms. And the idea that they then get used to say, oh, then we can escape the problems of capitalism would be ridiculous. But where it could be useful is where we then look at how can the state and how can local government scale up those good things. Now that's a very interesting question. How can we have a partner state for the social and solidarity economy, for regenerative enterprises, for cooperatives? Brilliant conversation, brilliant area for policy innovation. If academics are having that mindset, so that epistemic respect, how can we help? How can we bring policymakers to the table to scale these up? Great. However, quite a lot of the work I see being done by academics doesn't really originate or end in that space.
Okay, so two follow-up questions on that. First, when you say growth became God, you're talking about like a societal narrative. So we believe in the story of growth, and thus is God and his dogma, and thus you go that way unquestionably. And I was wondering if degrowth, I also, the word doesn't sell, let's put it this way. Is it not trying to create kind of a counter narrative that you can meet other people with different struggles but in the same thing, like, I don't know, the Global South called itself, or Eco Sarwaj, or that was one. And another thing is, for me, it really does not make sense to talk about degrowth without talking about collapse, in course and incoming. But still, and it's interesting because I agree with you. Calling degrowth initiatives to things that are happening on the ground without any connection with degrowth is. But the things that it instills and that it glorifies, or that it says, okay, this should be there and this should be that and this is this and this is that, is forgetting the word resilience building, because no one knows what that is. Is it not helpful in terms of supporting, giving some validation, putting in networks, registering about, do those degrowth initiatives, are they not important to the resilience building that we will need facing collapse?
So definitely having terms, having language that helps us identify each other is useful when we can learn from each other, and also then possibly access resources from each other to do similar things. So it would be useful for people who are working locally in their time banks or their community food growing or clothes swapping initiatives, or so many different things, stacks. It would be good if they can find out who else is doing it and learn from them, and possibly then even access some grants and so on. Yes. And then that also means the power of example is quite useful too. So there's a role for storytelling as well, therefore, in relation to that. But you're also pointing to something else, which is how do we then build from that to create something that might lead to some kind of massive societal transformation? And then we get into the questions of, well, does massive societal transformation really depend on stories about how we're all part of some movement of change, a social movement? And so yes, terminology does matter, but the people who study social movements say that what's crucial is shared identity, but that can't be imposed. That has to be discovered and formed together. Don't say, you're a degrower now, enjoy the term, start wearing the t-shirt, and we change the world. No, it's got what is the real identity that people seem to share? You've got to be curious about that, find out, and try different things. Something might work in one country and not another. And then you've also got to look at how resource mobilization and how people can improve their lives and have financial support for what they're doing. That's important in social movements. And then also the political opportunity structure. What are the ways that people can express and politically mobilize? And that's changing always over time. So framing, narratives, storytelling is an important part of the bigger process of change. Yeah. And you also mentioned collapse, but then we could talk about collapse as one of those possible frames, possible ways that people self-identify, but also as a changing political opportunity structure, to use social movements theory, whereby, well, maybe the way that people get their life needs and aspirations met through the market, through state provision, those things are breaking down, and not just a little bit and more annoying cost of living and a little bit more annoying austerity. No, these things are actually breaking down. If that is the context, that's a fundamentally different context for us thinking about social movements. So I think collapse is a very powerful framing for both the identity of people about what they're doing and why, and also, if it's true, which I think it is, then it means a very different structure around us, a political opportunity structure.
I think probably the term degrowth is also so menacing, actually. People, they feel very uncomfortable when they hear the term degrowth, actually, because as you explained before, all our system, social and economic system, is built on this software that is running, the growth software, actually, of the financial system, monetary system, that is running this growth software, and the system will break down if the software fails, actually. And so this is menacing, but on the other side, we see that this, like the minority world, the societies, the minority world of the global north, they are built on the appropriation of work and resources from the global south. So actually, if we accept that there are limits, and that we have to share resources more equally between the global north and the global south, this system that runs on growth in the global north is bound to fail, and has to fail, actually. So there are strong movements actually in the global south, and you talk about this in your book as well. And there's a delinking movement that it cuts the ties actually of the commercial, international commercial system with the global north. So how could we actually, at some people that are aware that this collapse is happening and it's unavoidable, how can we be and skip in solidarity with the movements in the global south?
So I want to go back to the first thing you said of degrowth as a term can seem a bit frightening. I know that the people in politics and policy making and politicians I know on the centre and left of politics, they would never use the term degrowth. It doesn't come across well, and I've done work in political communications in the UK in the 2017 general election, and it's like, how is that going to get someone who's struggling to pay the bills excited that you matter to them? So it's a bit weird that people who say that they're interested in degrowth because that will help develop a policy relevant agenda, choose a term that might have a little bit more legs in terms of how policymakers and politicians and people who run think tanks might want to use. So just on that point. So that's frightening. Just unappealing to people in policy and politics is my experience. Unless they're just wanting to give you a big grant and make you smile and make you go away and go back to your library for 2 years and do nothing, then they're quite happy. Show up at the European Commission, we'll give you a few million to say degrowth and go away and be useless. Absolutely, fine. It's fantastic. It doesn't frighten them.
But it's
It
actually
doesn't frighten them at all. But you're talking about the Global South, so you switched to talk about the Global South and delinking and all that.
Yeah, because I switched because if we accept that there has to be some equality, and that we have to redistribute resources, and that in a shrinking, shrinking framework of resources, actually, we have to redistribute. So this system that we are running, the software of growth, cannot survive. Yeah, and that is a real menace, and that the people, I think, maybe they want to ignore, the politicians want to ignore it. Even in the left and in the center and center left, they are running on the same software that is, the system has to increase. But if we put this into perspective on a global perspective, we see that it's even more difficult that this has any chance of success in the future. How do you join these two dots? In your book, you ask some questions about that, and you make some statements about that as well.
So if a politician really accepts that infinite economic growth on a planet of finite resources is impossible, and that we're crashing into limits, and the question is how hard, how fast, and how bad. If they really accept that, then they need to have monetary reform and monetary innovation and non-monetized exchange systems. Those three things, they need to be as part of their political and policy platform. And that's tough, because then you've got all the bankers against you, as well as not just nationally, but internationally, and the bond markets. But you've got to have an agenda on that. And I don't think the only response is just reforming the banking system. You also need to help communities have meaningful community currencies and exchange systems which they themselves control. We don't want to create new dependencies and new opportunities for extortion of wealth and revenues from communities. So that's, otherwise, without that as part of the political plan, then any policies to get away from GDP growth will end up causing recession. It will be lovely that we'll have more community exchange systems and time banks and community allotments, but then if people are losing their houses because the banks are repossessing them because the people lost their jobs because there was no money in the economy anymore, then you're not going to last long as a government. So we need people to include the money system in their thinking if they're serious about degrowth, even if they choose not to use the degrowth term as part of their pitch. But you also asked about the South and Do you want to? So the global south and
because this our current system is built on the appropriation of value from the global south, resources and labor. Yeah, so that is not a system that can go on actually, so at least should not go on and will not go on, because the people in the global south, they organize against it. They will organize against it possibly, and this will actually put into question our system of here in the global north, all these amenities that we are used to. So how can we, as people that are concerned about the collapse and people that are activists somehow, political activists, and on the left, how can we support these people in the global south, and how can we integrate this question into our narrative?
Okay. So some parts of the, we generalize a lot when we talk about global north or global south, to a degree that's possibly rendering our conversation meaningless. But let's start with that. Even within Europe, some countries still have more people who own their own land and produce some food locally. And there are some countries where absolutely not. So the UK and Holland, for example. But in Portugal, in Italy, in Greece, there's a lot more still sort of small farm ownership and still existing traditions of gifting and swapping at local level. So that kind of social soft infrastructure is still there. And therefore a loss of imports of produce and raw materials and energy from the rest of the world will have less of an impact in the quality of life of people. So some countries are super, super, super dependent on imports for everything, like my country, the United Kingdom. However, having said that, and this is difficult to say and difficult to hear, and sad as well, because for those of us who live in Europe, most of the friends and family are in Europe, but the future ahead is poverty, because the way of life is so dependent on the extraction of resources from so many people, in the global south. And that is, as you say, not a sustainable scenario, and it's already breaking, and there are also now more powerful political movements across the global south to not allow such an expropriation of resources so cheaply to send to the West. So yes, the way collapse is experienced for people is just the spreading and deepening of poverty. At the moment we call it cost of living crisis rather than the explosion of poverty or whatever, but that's the way it is. And how do we try and help each other if that is the future for so many people? You start by being honest about it, and then then you have to look at redistribution. You have to look at redistribution. You can't pretend anymore that somehow we'll have an escalator of consumption and then the poor people will have a better standard of living in 10, 20 years. They won't. They'll have a worse standard of living unless there's more effective redistribution of a smaller pie.
Building a little bit on that and on some reflections, historical reflections, like when we had collapses of Western societies, let's see, like Europe in the mid-19th century, 20th century, with the world wars, then suddenly you have a big movement of liberation throughout the world because they couldn't hold the colonial empires that they had. And then, you had that complications after with the Cold War, but there was a lot of liberation movements in India and etc. that emerged from this lack of power, lack of capacity of European powers to maintain those territories. So in one way, if you think of the system that we live in as such a destructive system for people and nature, the collapse of it is not something all bad. Let's put it. It's not gonna be fun, especially for the people that live through this modernity. But there's a lot of positive things that can come from it. One of them being like freeing up space and creating that. There's this notion of liminality, of where you have a crisis of meaning, and suddenly the tale of growth doesn't apply anymore, and the ideas that are there, you can grab them, and the global south will have their paths and their ways that are going to in a way be like gain that space from the developed from the global north, retreating from that power position. So when I wanted to ask you about that, with that in mind, and going back to the reflection of how degrowth and the notions of collapse can move us into action and into like reorganization. When I talk about organizing around collapse and around degrowth, and I'll bring the topic that we discussed briefly yesterday, I look at local action that you can do. So instead of projecting this, how can we save the global south and work with them? And our solidarity networks, of course, but there's a lot to do in terms of preparing for that poverty that you talk locally. And I was wondering if a very important part of that is to build infrastructure to get ready for that, so more local, the local currency, the local production, even the proximity, democracy, etc. What is the role for protecting the ecosystems from this late stage extractivism that we're living in? And there's in France, there's examples of communities moving not to let that infrastructure being installed. Like if you think of ZAD de Notre-Dame-des-Landes, where people went there and defended it with cocktail Molotovs against a state that wanted to build a mega airport. Or if you see what happened later now with the Soulèvement de la Terre, where there you have tens of thousands of people going into industrial infrastructure and breaking it down, basically, so that you don't take water of the aquifers and you don't perpetuate that kind of agriculture. How do you see a relation between building a new world and defending the natural one that it will have to be based upon at the local scale, and then the connection with the global south?
So, spending our time creating alternatives to the market economy, to dependence on global supply chains, great. We all believe in that, no matter what label we put on it, as activists, practitioners, or academics, or policymakers.
It's like a best shot kind of strategy.
Yeah, we all believe in that. And I agree that the global system of capitalism and imperialism and colonialism still exists and will continue to exist during the further breakdown of industrial consumer systems. We're seeing that, like fracking. Fracking came along to make sure we still got the gas. We'll destroy the water tables just so long as we can get the natural gas, fossil gas. We're seeing that now with the Brazilian government saying we're going to dig up the Amazon and move off the indigenous people because we need what's under their feet to make batteries and wires so we can all drive electric cars, and such like. So yes, the logic of the system continues. The logic is acquisitive, extractivist, dominating, and ultimately violent if you disagree, in a meaningful way, rather than just give me a grant, let me write a paper about it. So, what to do about that? Well, obviously, people will try and resist in all manner of ways. Yeah. I wonder how useful it is to, like, how much of a model it is to actually, well, you mentioned violent resistance. Violent resistance might work in some cases, but generally it doesn't work because it empowers the state and it justifies them to criminalize everyone who has a different view to them and become very repressive. So, and we see different opportunities for that in different countries. So we've seen the military take power in some parts of Africa on an explicitly anti-colonial, anti-imperialist agenda. And in some cases it looks like they're doing a good job in implementing that. It seems like they are doing what they said they would do. So I'm not completely against people looking at different ways to resist and to take power, but I think a lot of the claims or calls for action of sabotage are a bit naive and could be counterproductive. It's more coming from a place of exasperation. So I don't know how much I would generalize from the example. I don't know them. I find it difficult to criticize people who might then try and stop an airport and use violent means against property. I find it difficult to criticize them because I can understand where they're coming from, and if they've had success with that, okay, but I don't see it as it's not something I advocate, because I just see how it's then used against us by the state. So yeah, and also I've talked about this, I think I even mention it in my book, that there's a history of industrial sabotage that has worked, but that's from the inside, not from the outside. So it's, for example, trade unionists who are upset they haven't got their new pay deal, and suddenly they start making things badly. So the doors fall off the cars, and they go and talk to management and say, yeah, we don't know why we've got this problem, maybe people are feeling upset. And then so there's even some good publications on the history of industrial sabotage in industrial relations journals. It seems to have been a secret tactic of trade unions over maybe centuries. So that would apply today, for example. So rather than having a handful of anti-genocide campaigners outside an arms company, or spray painting or something, it'd be far better to have people who work in the arms company accidentally deleting databases or ordering the wrong spare parts.
Like the workers in the ports of Marseille that wouldn't let it board.
Yeah, so that would be in disruption internally, yes.
I want to shift like a little bit the conversation because it's also a challenge for us, like emotionally, to deal with the problem of collapse, and that all this, the societal breakdown actually. Yeah, because when you're talking about the time frame is getting like shorter because collapse is already ongoing or it's close. Yeah, so collapse to like on a scale that would be noticeable to ordinary people like us, or to the more like privileged people maybe that we represent actually. And there's this fear that causes fear. It gets its emotional response, and then so we enter in denial. It's very close, as you described also in your book, actually, to the fear of death. Yeah. So we think death is something that is very far away from us. Yeah, so we are in a denial, and Vanessa Machado Oliveira also describes that we have to overcome this denial of these different aspects of collapse, actually, to move forward and to get into a new meaning, and to encounter ways forward from this. And actually, academia is actually, in her terms, academia supports actually the colonial modernity, yeah, and so that it resounds much with what you said about academia before. But I would like to know how we can deal with this, with our own fear, and the fear that we have for ourselves or for our children, if we have children. And with the fear of that, and the resistance that this fear causes in other people that we talk to, and as we talk about these concepts.
Yeah, it's a painful topic, a frightening topic. You're right, a lot of people, when they're facing difficulties, whether you're lucky enough so the difficulties are more on your TV screen, and maybe the strange views of your friends, rather than, like, if you're unlucky, it will be an impossible cost of living or a forest fire destroying your community, and so on. So when we when we talk about this, we're not saying to each other, "Oh, don't worry, it's going to get better." So the normal way of having, if you're upset in life, if you've broken up with a partner or you've lost someone, say, "Don't worry, you'll get over this," or there's always the story of a better tomorrow, and we're not providing consolation to each other with this framing of collapse. So it's tough. Initially, it doesn't help alleviate the pain and the fear that people are experiencing from a more difficult life and more worrying news on telly. Doesn't help. And so I think it needs to come with an ongoing conversation. So when I published Deep Adaptation, I had a lot of response from media, and I said, I don't want to be interviewed on television where this will just be a tiny piece, and then people will just hear that the climate is much worse than we thought, and it's going to collapse societies, and then just leave that. That doesn't help. So I only did interviews with people who were newspaper journalists who would do, or magazine journalists who would do it better, or podcasts who would do it better. And so people, if they felt emotionally ready to engage with this framing, they could then read it, they could then engage with it, and then there would be more space for a bigger conversation about what does this mean, what are the emotions, how do we help each other live with this view. Yeah, there'll be lots of reactions, like there'll be panic, and there'll be people wanting to know, where should I live, should I have kids, and just, and all these sorts of things. That's just part of the process. It has been for me and other people the last 7 years. And the worry doesn't go away, but lots of other things happen which are great. Like it's forced so many people to give up what they were worried about before, what they were working so hard on before, and to shift and prioritize other things which tend to be much more present and human. They enjoying themselves with their loved ones and appreciating what they already have rather than striving for more. It's quite an interesting shift that happens. People giving up their jobs to become full-time activists or community leaders. That's happened. So I think, I like to tell people the positive sides of accepting that things are not going to turn around. Some people then will want a story of some kind of new society that will emerge from the ashes of this one breaking down. And some people feel that that's storytelling and we don't know. And I'm the second person. I think we don't know, but I accept that some people want to tell a story of there's going to be an ecological civilization that's going to emerge from the collapse of this industrial consumer civilization. Okay, if you want that story, and if that helps you keep going and helps you also stay present to reality rather than get lost in your story, then fine. But a lot of people who believe in the ecological civilization emerging from the collapse of this one, not a lot. Some of the people I've spoken to, they seem to be attached. There seems to be a craving, a need for that vision. It's serving a function of calming them down in the present. And I think I've got to a place where I don't need those stories to cope with the present.
It's just the last one. You say, so you write in your book that there's some sort of beauty in this that is happening. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, it's a weird beauty. Beauty is an interesting word to use. And people can get a bit annoyed if they think, how could you talk about the loss of so many glorious species as in any way beautiful? How can you talk about the future death younger than expected of millions, if not billions of people because of the breaking down of industrial food systems? Where is there any beauty in any of that? The beauty in that is the beauty that existed in any life that is full of suffering, loss, and death, just like it's full of joy, creation, and contribution. So when we are awake to loss, death, suffering, and the fragility of everything and the impermanence of everything, when we're awake to that, it can inspire gratitude for everything that we experience in the moment. It can inspire, strangely, a kind of gratitude for what we learn from what we suffer from and what we lose. So, and that's, none of that is new. It's all in ancient wisdom, spiritual wisdom. There's some kind of strange beauty that can be found in suffering and loss. I do recognize that some people say that sounds very privileged, but actually people who've suffered the most often speak like that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jem, for being with us, for having this amazing interview. And so, thank you, Guilherme. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And see you soon.
Cheers.
And please find out more about Jem Bendell on this website. You can find it easily.
JemBendell.com.
You can find it easily on the internet. Thank you very much.